Cedric, just your reaction when you heard, I mean, this is estimates of some $7 billion in unrecoverable damage to these Tupolev bombers that predate Russian independence. I mean, this was really the Soviet aircraft that were targeted. Ukraine says as many as 40. That number may be in question, but Russia didn't have more than 100. And the significance here is that these were capable of carrying out long-range ballistic missile attacks into Ukraine. How big of a setback is this for Russia?
Well, this could be a huge setback for Russia, Beyana, and one of the key things about this is that the mechanisms that, we'll call them mechanisms for a second here, these aircraft that the Ukrainians hit, the Tupolev 95 and 22 aircraft, they are not only the aircraft that were used to attack Ukraine using cruise missiles, but they're also part of the nuclear deterrent that the Soviet Union and then Russia created. Not only for the Cold War, but in the post-Cold War period. And that's a significant thing because basically what the Ukrainians have done is taken out probably about a third or so of those aircraft from the Russian inventory. And that makes it very hard for the Russians to continue to prosecute the war like they did. And the one other thing that they did was they took out an A-50, which is a so-called mainstay aircraft. That's an AWACS-like aircraft. That means command and control. So now command and control is much more difficult for the Russians to exercise while they attack Ukrainian targets. So this is a very significant development.
I know that it took about 18 months to plan, and the Lieutenant General, who's head of Ukraine's main security and intelligence agency, the SBU, said that these were ordered specifically from President Zelensky. And in addition to the task of smuggling the drones into the country, they followed later by small wooden mobile cabins, people familiar with the planning said, and then the drones were concealed underneath these cabins where the roofs ultimately retracted after months of just sitting there. And we've seen some of the video of these drones then flying out and striking these air facilities throughout Russia. And, you know, it's important to highlight the size and scale of Russia and where these aircraft were located. The impact that has now in terms of how safe and secure the Russian Air Force and the Russian military in general feels about where they store their military equipment.
Yeah, this is a significant vulnerability. The Russians clearly thought that they were going to be safe, especially in Siberia, although there have been some indications that other air bases that the Russians have, once closer to Ukraine, were much more vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks. And that's kind of obvious from a geographic standpoint. But what the Ukrainians did was they, in essence, opened up Russia to these so-called first-person view drones. And these drones don't have a very long range. But the very fact that they were able to, in essence, subvert the Russian trucking system to get these drones into those wooden houses and then kind of do a James Bond-like retract the roof, type system where they actually moved the roofs back when they were ready to launch, that really shows a very high degree of planning, a very sophisticated planning effort. And, those 18 months or so that it took to plan this was basically 18 months very well spent because they not only looked at the target on the Ukrainian side, but they assessed exactly what it would take to go after all of these different targets, all of these different air bases that they hit. And these air bases included, places in Siberia, like we're seeing here, and then also places as far north as the Murmansk region on the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, above the Arctic Circle. So these are the kinds of things that the Ukrainians did, and the planning was masterful. It's basically on the scale of what you would have seen in World War II when Winston Churchill told his version of the SBU, the Special Operations Executive in his case, back in 1940, he said, "Set Europe ablaze." Well, the Ukrainians have set part of Russia ablaze, and it's a very significant development.
Yeah, I can't help but think of President Zelensky now in the Oval Office, going back to that disastrous meeting in February when President Trump and J.D. Vance famously, said to him, "You don't have the cards," and knowing that he had at least this card up his sleeve and had been in the works for months. Could any of this happen, in your view, without the aid of U.S. intelligence?
Yes, it could have. I mean, there are certain things that the Ukrainians certainly benefited from when it comes to U.S. intelligence. But the fact is that there's satellite imagery available through private open sources such as Maxar technologies, so they don't necessarily need the U.S. to do this. They could have also gotten some intelligence from the Europeans. But the Ukrainians have a very extensive intelligence network within Russia. And they've kind of proven that by conducting operations like this. And one thing we have to note is what President Zelensky said when he said that the, quote, office, unquote, meaning the, I guess, operational headquarters of at least part of this operation was right next to one of the regional headquarters of the FSB, the Russian State Security Service. So they were doing this right under the noses of the Russians, and that is certainly a very, very significant development from an intelligence perspective as well as from an operational perspective. Now it will, of course, depend on how long the effects are. This might not be as long-lasting a thing as the Ukrainians would like, but I think the effects are certainly there psychologically, kind of like the Doolittle raid, to use another World War II analogy, where we, attacked the Japanese and did it off of aircraft carriers, and the Japanese weren't expecting that at that particular point in time. So the Russians clearly weren't expecting this, and this is the result that we see right now.
I would imagine screenwriters are already busy working on Spider's Web and how they could turn that into a film as well. Cedric Leighton, thank you so much.
You bet, Beyana. Always good to be with you.